Hey there. Welcome to First Look. Thank you for being here this week as we get a little further from Easter. We get a little closer to Pentecost. And along the way, we're still trying to navigate what it is we're trying to understand about Judas, which is what we're doing this week. So this will be the third sermon, three of, well, a few. I can't remember if I did 4 or 5. I think I did 5 of the person of Judas. And one of the things that I've been trying to kind of move towards is how do we want to understand the person, but then also how does that allow us to understand ourselves a little bit better, and but also the church that was built after his death. And that's where I'm kind of rounding myself to now. Now that we've taken a little bit of time over the last couple of weeks just to kind of contemplate that. The next place I really want to move towards is what's the result, right? So we're in that pivot moment, right? About halfway through. So we're going to look at this text for this morning. This is Luke 22. So Luke 22 verses 1 through 6. And some of the passages I've chosen, we've looked at really like kind of picked apart. I'm kind of going to use this passage more as a launching pad to discuss discuss some ideas about Judas. I think a little bit more thoroughly. So let me read the passage first, and then we can kind of talk about it. All right. So again, this is Luke 22 verses 1 through 6. Now the festival of unleavened bread, which is called the Passover, was near. And the chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to put Jesus to death, for they were afraid of the people. That part's going to be important. They were afraid of the people. So we're going to talk about that. And then this is the part that we could probably, the next verse is probably the part that we could talk about endlessly. All right. Verse 3 says, "Then Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was one of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and the officers of the temple police about how he might betray him to them. They were greatly pleased and agreed to give him money. So he consented and began to look for an opportunity to betray him to them when no crowd was present." Okay. So this is the plot. And I think I called this particular sermon Zealous. And I did so for a couple of different reasons, because I think that what we see here is not just a Judas problem, but we're seeing more of the conspiracy of course, isn't just him, but he needs people to kind of do this with him, right? He can't do this by himself. And you'd have to ask yourself, some really interesting questions about what kind of happens in this moment. But I think in order to get our minds around any of it, I think that we have to spend a little bit of time trying to understand motive. So I think I don't want to give a direct example in our lifetime, whether it's like a legal example or a political example or a corporate example, or even a sports analogy. I don't want to do any of those things necessarily, but I do want us to kind of take the bits of history and take the bits of the culture around you and try to draw off of them as we're talking about this. Because one of the things that I think fascinates me about Judas specifically is that you can kind of take it at some basic level and say to yourself, here is a person who is just not a good person, and he's doing bad things, and he wants bad things for people, and he's willing to go to any lengths to kind of keep himself on top, right? He's willing to switch sides. He's take the money where he can, that kind of thing. And if you just read this passage, if you only read this chapter, or even the chapters sort of around it, you would see this kind of cartoonish type. I mean, keep using that term, cartoonish. I only mean like such a straightforward, no subtlety kind of way of understanding someone. Face value. That he's just this epitome of someone who is bad, and almost like a character out of a play or something. But I think if we're going to take any of this, seriously, then we're going to look at it from a more like we would a real, we're going to look at this as a real person, because that's one, because I think Judas was a real person, and two, because I think that's the only way to faithfully have any kind of real assessment of what's going on and what value it is to us. If we only look at it as someone on a piece of paper, then I don't think that's as helpful. But if we try to get into the real situation that they were in, I think that's a little bit more genuine and will hopefully kind of get us somewhere. So when you think about all of the elements around this person, 3 years with Jesus, chosen by Jesus, accepted by his fellow disciples, one of which was a zealot. And all of them had, again, as I've said a few times, a want and a need to see the world be different. That I think on some level, even if he was a deceitful person, even if he was always eventually going to do this, I think that he still wanted the same thing that everyone else wanted. Maybe he wanted it for different reasons, but I think he wanted what everyone wanted, which was, as I've said, the empire to be gone, Israel to be free, and to be able to rule itself in the land that God had given them with freedom. Okay, I think they wanted that. I think they all did. And I think Judas wanted it for his own reasons. Maybe he wanted power, maybe he wanted influence, but there's nothing other than these moments that we have to kind of go by. And so we know what he does to get there, and then we know the kind of guilt that he felt in his own death. Right? So we have all of that as things that we can count on as true. And because what we don't see, and what I keep kind of thinking back to that supports my idea, I think, of he wasn't an inherently deceitful person. He may have done deceitful things, but I don't think his only motive was deceit. I think one of his great motives was, I want the world to be different, and I think I know how I want the world to be different. When it doesn't work, he takes his own life. Because if you're following the logic that he had somehow turned, that maybe he did believe in Jesus for a certain amount of time, but at some point he realized that Jesus was not going to do what he wanted him to do, and so he turned on him because he felt like he would go further turning on him and going with the Sanhedrin or going with the Romans or whatever, that he could get a better deal that way. if he did think that, if he did turn on Jesus because he believed that he could gain power or gain, come out of this alive, and that turning him in was the only way to kind of get out of this, right? That was his escape card. Death by his own hand doesn't make any sense to me, because the Romans and the Sanhedrin stay in power, right? It's not like they lose anything. They don't at some point, nothing slips out of their hands, at least not initially. If what he really wanted was, what Judas really wanted was some like power on the other side, he could have had it, right? He did the work. The guy died. Jesus was put to death, and Judas ends it before he's resurrected. It's not like he was resurrected and Judas thought, oh no, like he was the real deal and I screwed all this up, and now the Romans or the Sanhedrin or somebody's gonna be mad at me and they're gonna, none of that happened. He ended it before Jesus returned. And so that's why I think he genuinely believed that if I do this, I can force Jesus' hand. I can force him to do this. And when I see this part of Satan entering into Judas, I'll have to do some research on how we can appropriately interpret that. But if we take it at any kind of face value, like evil entered him in whatever way you want to take that. I don't know if Satan made him do it, but certainly had influence. Because if you remember, Satan didn't try to make Jesus do anything, right? Maybe he realized he couldn't. But he doesn't try to make him do anything, but he sits with him and he influences him and he shows him that, power and safety and, sustenance could be his if he only followed, what he had to say. And maybe something similar happens to Judas, just Judas isn't, Jesus, and so can't, push it away. Maybe when we think about, this is the end of the story. Like this whole trek of Jesus begins with the temptation, right? I mean, I don't think it's on accident that this story is bookended by Satan showing up in the beginning with Jesus and at the end with Judas. One temptation that is unsuccessful and one temptation that is successful. Because Judas, maybe that was the push that Judas needed, the temptation that he needed, because that's what, Satan is always talked about as a tempter, right? If you think about Adam and Eve, if you think about this story, you think about the wilderness story, Satan's always a tempter, is always showing you some alternate reality. Didn't make Adam and Eve, didn't like force feed them the apple or the fruit, but says, see this fruit, it'll do X and Y and Z for you. Go get it and this will be better, right? I'm tempting. My gut says that we kind of are supposed to look at this a similar way, that Judas was drawn to something that he was already thinking. Judas wanted to see this happen, that Jesus would take over and the disciples would take over and the Romans would be kicked out. He wanted to see this happen. And he was willing to go to the extreme, and the temptation was too strong. That's at least my perspective. Now, again, I'm going to look into it a little bit more, but this is a first look, and so I'm just kind of doing this off the top of my head. So we kind of see Judas give in to something that he was already feeling. And I think that one of the things that I, again, have been trying to kind of get my head around is that the want for that was so strong. And I think that Judas is the evidence that the way that people wanted to see, I mean, there were zealots for a reason, right? People who were willing to go to extreme lengths to revolt against and to entice others to revolt against the empire. And I think that sentiment, that zealous sentiment, I think we see, we kind of see throughout the Gospels. Not only because there was this clear us versus them mentality, right? You have like John the Baptist, for instance. He doesn't go to violent extremes to push this kind of new way, but he does go to extremes, right? He doesn't just fold into the tapestry of what was happening at the time. He came from a priestly line. He could have just done the more standard way of living like his father did, but instead he didn't do any of that, right? He was a radical in that way. And so I think they were living in these very kind of radical times, where like the old way or was starting to kind of fade anyway. Like what had it always been must have been kind of precarious. There must have been something precarious about it. And the reason I say that is because one, I think someone like Jesus, someone like John the Baptist could gain that kind of following, and they weren't thwarted right away. But also you see that like it wasn't that much longer. It was maybe another generation, and the temple was destroyed. The Romans kind of came for the temple and destroyed it. And so it was already kind of moving in that direction of this kind of violence was kind of on the horizon, or change was on the horizon. And I think maybe Jesus saw a moment where maybe he could turn that into a different direction. And so, I think that someone like Judas, the feelings that he had were not isolated to him. He just was willing to and was too tempted to not go through with what he did, but then recognized that like, oh, I shouldn't have done that, and was overwhelmed by guilt. And it's funny when you not funny. I think what's fascinating about his story is his deep-seated desire to see the world be different, or see his world be different. Again, even if it was for his own gain, even if it was out of selfishness, he still desperately wanted the world to be different. That's my contention. And what I'm starting to wonder about is, the disciples had to endure the knowledge of his death, endure seeing Jesus die, but of course, see also his resurrection. But nothing redemptive that they ever see happens with the life of Judas. But you start to wonder what they learned from it. And I'm going to kind of mention it a little bit in this particular sermon, but then also kind of allude to it a little bit more in the fourth sermon. I think that this kind of sets up a place where, after the dust had settled, Jesus had resurrected, Judas was gone, they were, maybe after the ascension, they had to start deciding what they were going to do now, right? That's where this all goes. This eventually gets to the disciples having to make a choice about how they were going to proceed and create the church that they do. And I think if you combine what they must have realized with Jesus, that Jesus was not trying to overthrow the government in that way, but was trying to create a new path. If you take that idea and then you take the loss of Judas and everything that happened with him, if you take both of those things at the same time, I think where it leads you to, or at least where I can see how it led them to, is a place where they recognize that if we're going to do this church thing, it has to be, like, we have to start from scratch. Like, we have to crumple up the script and start with a blank sheet of paper. And some part of that is going to have to be that we have to let go of power. Power corrupts. We're seeing it's a problem of power. Not who has the power. Not the right people having the power. But power in itself, human power, is a dangerous thing. And we have to try to figure out how we are going to dampen that, level that in some way. Maybe we can't eliminate it, but we have to figure out a way that the pursuing of power doesn't consume us. And the only way it seems like we can do that is to create a community where there's a leveler playing field when it comes to authority. And we see some examples of that, and I'm going to talk about the early church eventually. But that's part of my contention, is that the movement of Judas to help get things to where they went, and that influence of Satan, in this story. And Satan, of course, was the one when it was with Jesus, was always tempting him with safety and power and strength and authority and not wanting of things, right? And something, I think there's some dots that were connected for the disciples that tell them, we are not doing this the right way. We have to eliminate that moving forward because it's killing us. And what's funny is as Presbyterians, not that we get it all right by any means, but some of that, I think the evidence of that for me shows up in the church that we have. Because if you notice, authority and power is spread out, right? I, or the person in my chair, can't ultimately decide anything. There's no one person that does anything. You have a congregation, a whole group that decides who sits in this chair. You have a session of 12 people that decide what happens in this church, and that they only get there if the whole says yes to them. So you have a whole system where everyone in it has the same kind of yes and no authority. They say yes to who represents them. They say yes to who sits in certain positions. They say that's all of that is done by the group, right? There is no strong man idea. And we get that directly from the process that was gone through to get us to the early church. Elders, deacons, flatter structure, all of that comes right from Scripture. But we are also people who are entrenched in the society in which we live, right? And we live in the United States. And we struggle with this dynamic of ultimate authority and how our representatives represent us. We struggle with that idea all the time. With elections, with voting, with our participation in society, with how we navigate all that. We struggle with that a lot. And I think that that's a really relevant thing to be thinking about as we're, thinking about that from our own perspective. I think is a really relevant way of sort of like also looking at what's happening in this text. And so I don't know how that influences the way that we think about our place in society, or the church's place in society, or our place in our church, or whatever. But I think that's worth thinking about. So I don't think that leads us to one particular place, but I'm hoping that you can kind of see how I can understand the influence that Judas and his actions potentially have on who we are today. And I think we can learn something from that. So that's kind of where I sit. That's where I'm starting from, is thinking through all of that as we go forward. So I hope that at least gives you a place to start as we're looking at this sermon for this week. If you're going to join us for the class, that's part of what I'm kind of thinking through. Okay. Well, thank you for doing this with me, as always. I really appreciate the fact that you're willing to do this. I hope that you can join us on Thursday at 11 if you can. If not, I will send out the kind of a recap. As always, thank you for all the ways that you support this and the ministry of Northmont, and I will see you next time for another First Look. So take care.